Jewish point of view, where we don't believe in the divinity of Christ. I think that there you can make an argument that the Gospels, which were written,
he was just a prophet. Right?
No. We don't even believe he was a prophet.
What do you think he was? What do you guys think?
What do I think he was historically? I think he was a Jew who tried to lead a revolt against the Romans and got killed for his trouble, just like a lot of other Jews at that time who were crucified for trying to lead revolts against the Roman and got killed for their trouble.
So he became legend in story, and it became a bigger and bigger deal as time went on.
Yeah, he had a group of followers, and then that gradually grew, and then
do you think he was resurrected?
No, that's not a Jewish belief.
Okay, I just want to check.
Yeah, no, we're not into
we're
not into miracle stories. No, that's not.
Now, in the clip that you're about to watch, you're going to see a rare moment where I believe Ben Shapiro loses a debate. Now, really quick, before we get into our main clip with William Lane Craig and his debate with Ben Shapiro, I just wanted to point out that a month before this interview, Ben says this to Joe Rogan about his view of Jesus. Ben doesn't believe that Jesus is, of course, the Messiah, but he doesn't even believe that he was a prophet or even a good teacher. He thinks he's just a Jewish person who led a revolt against the Romans, even though Jesus, before his death and resurrection, never actually called for that. Isn't that interesting? Jesus would say things like this, and Jesus said to them, "Pay to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." If Jesus was really trying to lead a revolt against the Romans, why on earth would he tell them to pay their taxes to the Romans? Interesting. And Pilate himself, the Roman governor, couldn't even find a charge against Jesus. He says this, "But Pilate said to the chief priests and to the crowds, I find no grounds for charges in the case of this man." So I'm telling you, if Jesus was really trying to lead a revolt against the Romans, Pilate, a Roman governor, would have been able to discern that, and he would have crucified him for it. But even Pilate, a Roman governor, couldn't do that. I just wanted to point that out before we get into our main clip. But before we dive into this clip, I just want to say I actually enjoy listening to Ben Shapiro. I listen to him a lot, usually at least once a week. I like some of his political views. I might not agree with everything that this man believes, of course, but I just wanted to give a shout out to him. I do enjoy listening to him mostly. But when it comes to Jesus, I disagree with his views. But let's get into this.
What is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the Gospels?
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets, and finally, that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had this radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And at the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15, all three of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "I am." And then virtually quoting from Daniel, "And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power." And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, "You have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need?" And Mark says they all condemned him as worthy of death. And that enabled them, since they didn't have the ability to carry out capital punishment, to deliver him over to the Roman authorities by slandering him as a pretender to be king of the Jews, and therefore a political figure who could be tried for treason and sedition and crucified.
So from the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually a punishable offense. Even that there are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves Messianic figures.
Absolutely.
The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, I am God, which would be a much more punishable offense, presumably that would be actual blasphemy. It's an oddity.
I think you're absolutely right in saying that Jesus' understanding of the Messiah was radically different from the prevailing cultural understanding of the Messiah among the chief priests and the common people. And he didn't meet their expectations. Indeed, that's what helped to get him crucified. Being the Messiah, you're right, in and of itself isn't a blasphemous claim. But to claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous and is sufficient for his condemnation. Now, the question...
Now, William Lane Craig is about to ask Ben a really good question, but before we get there, I just want to say William is spitting fire, and he's really focusing on the identity that Jesus was presenting to the crowds and to the people that he would speak to. Think about this. Jesus said, "The one who has seen me has seen the Father," in John 14:9. The disciples understood Jesus to be more than just a random person who decided he wanted to be the Messiah and overthrow the political arena to the point where Israel would be established as the ultimate kingdom or be liberated from any enslavement to another kingdom. The disciples understood him to be God with us. It says in John 1:1, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." This was the disciple John's, revelation of who Jesus was. And just a couple verses later in John 1:14, and it says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." This is this connection that they understood Jesus to have with God the Father, even though Jesus is God the Son. It gets a little into the Trinity and that whole language, which is a fun topic to dive into, which I'm not going to dive into right now. But this was what John wrote about Jesus in John 1:18. Think about this. This is about the identity of Jesus, which is so important. It says, "No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known." Oh my goodness, mind-blowing. But this is why they wanted to pick up stones and kill him, because they understood that Jesus was claiming to be one with God and even God, which was probably very confusing to them. But you can even find connections with this in the Old Testament. You just have to dig. And so, cherry on top, and we'll dive right back into the video. Jesus said this in John 8:58. He says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." I encourage you to dive into that passage because Jesus is directly connecting himself with the God who revealed himself to be the I am to Moses in Exodus 3, verses, I think it's 14 through 15. Really cool stuff, but let's continue.
And I think that is raised by your
Interpretation,
question, Ben.
yes.
Yeah, your interpretation, Ben, is this. Why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held? And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead. Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be, and that therefore I follow Jesus in his conception of what it means to be the Messiah.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
So one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the gospel revelations, for example.
Now, I think it's important to understand, Ben, that in order for a historical document to be reliable, it isn't required that it be inerrant.
Contemporaneous, of course.
So,
of course.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts, which are supported by the historical evidence, and which surprisingly, I did my doctoral work on this in Germany, are recognized as such by the majority of New Testament scholars today who studied the historical Jesus. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. The vast majority of scholars have come to accept as convincing the evidence in support of those three facts, not assuming biblical inerrancy or inspiration, but treating the Gospels as ordinary historical documents. You can show, for example, that the fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So these three facts are pretty firmly established, and the only question is then how do you best explain them? And down through history, attempts have been made to explain these facts without recourse to the resurrection, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. And I would argue that none of these naturalistic theories meets the criteria for being the best historical explanation of the facts. None of them is as good an explanation as the one that the original disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if that's right, then I think we have good grounds, indeed are almost compelled to revise our typical understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be.
So we can have the historical argument back and forth, obviously, and I think that there are arguments that you can make. I think there are arguments that I can make, but I honestly find them relatively uninteresting, is the truth, simply because I'm not sure that we're going to come to any sort of consensus on them.
No.
On the historical argument, for example, I think it's fairly easy to claim there's a sect of Judaism right now in which there's a small subsection of people who believe that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is still alive. Right, the Lubavitcher Rebbe passed away in the 1990s,
yes.
And there's still people who treat him as though he is not dead. They call him the Messiah. They think that he was the political Messiah. They have and they still do that 20 years after his death. That's not proof to me that he is actually alive. Some of them claim to have experienced it. Right. So especially when you're talking about events 2,000 years ago, if people write that down, I think there's
I doubt
sufficient.
this man's tomb is empty.
I mean, I haven't dug him up, so,
Yeah.
so I wouldn't know. But
Yeah.
the claims, if somebody claimed 2,000 years from now that his tomb was empty, or claimed 70 years from now that his tomb was empty, then
Yeah, that's an important difference, Ben. The important time gap is not the gap between the events and the present. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence just because of the lapse of time. The critical event, as you just said, is the time gap between the events and the recording of those
correct.
events. And in the case of the events of the life of Jesus and his resurrection, that time gap is extraordinarily narrow. We can push back even before the writing of the Gospels and the epistles of Paul by discerning the traditions upon which they relied when they wrote. And some of these go back to within, it's estimated, 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. I'm thinking of the ones that Paul transmits to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 15. So we're on pretty good ground there in terms of the earliness and the multiplicity of our sources for the life of Jesus.
So let's talk for a second about sort of the necessity for Judeo-Christian revelation, because
So now Ben is about to transition or turn the conversation down a different path, down a different road. But one thing I really want to just make a point about here is Ben wrote a book called Facts Don't Care About Your Feelings. And I find it very interesting that when Ben is presented with multiple facts, hard facts about Jesus, his connection with the Old Testament and fulfilling certain realities, and his resurrection, and so on and so forth, his best argument is, I'm uninterested in that. And this is why I feel that he lost this debate, because that was his comeback. I'm uninterested in that. The truth is, like, if we really care about facts, we'll always be interested in them, not uninterested. Now, I want to dive into these three passages, because this is the thing that makes me go wild, because there's so much facts that point to Jesus being the Messiah, being what the Jewish people have been long awaiting. Look at this list. There's like over 300 different prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. This is crazy. The amount of prophecies that he fulfilled is mind-blowing and impossible when you really dive into the chances that this would just randomly happen. It's amazing. But before I read these three passages, I just want to say, stick around, because we're going to pray for Ben, because I care about Ben and I want to actually pray for him at the end of this video. But listen to this. It says this in Acts 10:43. All the prophets testify of him, talking about Jesus. All the prophets testify of Jesus, that through his name, everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins. This was the understanding of the early disciples, that all the prophets testified of Jesus, when you really dug into what the prophets had to say. Look at this. This is just an example. I'm going to give you two examples of this so that you can just see it for yourself. This is Zechariah 12:10. It says, "And I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of pleading, so that they will look at me whom they pierced, and they will mourn for him." Did you notice that? They will look at me whom they pierced, and they will mourn for him. Interesting language. Like one mourning for an only son. Interesting language. "And they will weep bitterly over him, like the bitter weeping over a firstborn." And John 19:37 says that this was fulfilled. The disciples connected Jesus to this very passage in Zechariah being fulfilled through Jesus, Really interesting. Now, one more just example of this so that you can just clearly see it. This is Isaiah 53, verses 4 through 5, a famous passage that, if you look into it, Jewish people actually pursue not to study and even sometimes are told not to read, which I find so wild. I've listened to Jewish commentators bring this up. But listen to this and see how you see Jesus in this Old Testament passage that Isaiah prophetically wrote. However, it was our sicknesses that he himself bore and our pains that he carried. Yet we ourselves assumed that he had been afflicted, struck down by God, and humiliated. But he was pierced for our offenses. He was crushed for our wrongdoings. The punishment for our well-being was laid upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. The disciple Matthew wrote in Matthew 8:17 that Jesus fulfilled this as well and pointed to the very prophetic thing spoken by Isaiah right here was fulfilled through the life and ministry of Jesus. This is just two examples, and there's so many more, but I just wanted to bring this up just to lay down some, again, hard facts about how the Old Testament pointed to Jesus and how Jesus fulfilled what the Old Testament pointed to the realities that the Messiah would step into and fulfill and walk in. Jesus did this. It's a very beautiful thing. And so I just want to pray for Ben. I encourage you to join in with me right now, praying for Ben, that he would have like a Saul to Paul moment where he would encounter Jesus and his eyes would be open to the fact that he is the Jewish Messiah, that Ben and all the Jewish people are actually awaiting for and who's truly already come and will come a second time. And then he'll deal with the kingdoms of this world and fully and all the more establishing the kingdom of Israel. And invite all those that have pursued to put their faith in him from the beginning until now. Really good stuff. But yeah, I just thank you, Father, for Ben Shapiro. I thank you that you love him like crazy. I just ask, God, that just like you encountered Saul and then how he transitioned from that moment and transition into being known as Paul, I just ask that you'd have just a similar moment with Ben in accordance with your grace, in accordance with your mercy, Lord. I just ask that you would encounter Ben, that you'd open up his mind to understand the scriptures, that you'd open up his eyes to see you for who you really are, that you would give him a revelation of who Jesus is, like you did with Peter. I ask, God, that you would open up his eyes to the fact that he is the Messiah, that he has been looking for and awaiting. He is the one who can save him. I just ask, God, that you would just bring that awakening to Ben, to his family, and to his Jewish people. In Jesus' name, amen. If you guys enjoyed that kind of content, I encourage you to follow and subscribe because I'll be posting more stuff like this. And then I have a ton of other videos just diving into some of the things that I'm passionate about. But I love you guys, and I'll see you in the next one.